In the spring of 2002, a 30-year-old man with bleached blonde hair stood backstage at a sold-out stadium, staring intensely into a cracked green room mirror. He was wearing an oversized gray tracksuit, his hands wrapped in tight athletic tape as if he were preparing for a heavyweight prize fight. To the millions of screaming fans outside, he was Slim Shady, a lyrical terror who could single-handedly tear down Hollywood elite, mainstream pop stars, and Washington politicians with a single, vicious punchline. Yet, if you looked closer at his dressing room table, past the security badges and the energy drinks, you would have seen something completely unexpected. A small, crumpled photo of a little girl named Haley, alongside a scribbled notebook filled with thousands of cross-referenced words, rhyming dictionaries, and deep, existential anxieties about failing as a father. This is the central, explosive paradox of modern American music. The world saw a dangerous cultural menace who was corrupting the youth of America, but history remembers a desperate, hyper-literate poet who had to build a lyrical monster just to protect his own sanity. Now, before we jump headfirst into the chaotic wreckage of this incredible year, do me a quick favor. Take a look down at that subscribe button. Give it a quick tap. It is completely free, it will not land you on a congressional hearing list, and unlike the music industry back in 2002, it is totally safe. Go ahead and smash that like button too, just to show the channel some love. It keeps these deep historical breakdowns alive, and honestly, it makes our comments section look a lot more civilized than it actually is. Done. Fantastic. Now let us travel back to the forgotten, rusted-out streets of Detroit, where this psychological storm first gathered. Looking back from the vantage point of 2026, it becomes absolutely clear that Eminem was never just a rapper. He was a generational lightning rod, a man violently torn between two irreconcilable identities. On one side was Marshall Mathers, a reclusive, deeply insecure young man who grew up in extreme poverty, constantly terrified that the state would step in and take away his daughter because he could not afford to keep the lights on. On the other side was Slim Shady, a commercial juggernaut who controlled the global pop culture narrative with an iron fist, a terrifyingly brilliant character who turned his personal trauma into multi-platinum records. He was an artistic savant who wanted nothing more than to be respected for his technical pen game, yet he chose to achieve that respect by setting fire to the very fabric of polite American society. So how does a broke kid who dropped out of the 9th grade after failing 3 times transform into the most feared cultural force on the planet? How does a social outcast from an unstable household become the absolute king of media, only to find himself locked inside a fortress of his own paranoia? To truly understand the explosive peak of his career, we have to look past the controversial headlines, past the parental advisory stickers, and past the massive record sales. We have to look at the brutal, unyielding internal warfare that shaped his greatest work. This is not just a story about a white kid making it big in hip-hop. This is a classic American tragedy about a man who built a monster to conquer the world, only to realize the monster was slowly consuming him from the inside out. To truly understand the venom in Eminem and Oppo's pen during his historic run, you have to look at the cracked foundation upon which his entire life was built. Marshall Mathers did not inherit a legacy of wealth or stability, he was born into a cycle of generational trauma and geographic displacement. He grew up on the dividing line of American segregation, just outside the northern border of Detroit along the infamous 8 Mile Road. His father vanished when he was just an infant, leaving him in the care of his teenage mother, Debbie. Together, they lived a transient, nomadic existence, packing their entire lives into garbage bags and moving from one trailer park to another across Missouri and Michigan. He was always the new kid in the neighborhood, the skinny white boy trapped in predominantly black, impoverished communities, forced to learn the brutal language of survival before he even knew who he was. But the poverty of the streets was nothing compared to the psychological warfare happening inside his own home. His mother struggled heavily with severe prescription drug addiction and unstable mental health, creating an unpredictable, hostile domestic environment. At school, things were even worse. Marshall was a quiet, introverted child who found solace in drawing comic books and reading dictionaries. His gentle nature made him a prime target for severe schoolyard bullying. In the 9th grade, a brutal assault by a repeat bully left him with severe brain swelling, putting him in a coma for several days. This catastrophic trauma shattered his remaining sense of security, convincing him that the world was a cruel, unforgiving place that would beat him to death if he did not find a way to strike back. It was during this dark period of isolation that the young poet found his sanctuary in hip-hop. He discovered that while he was completely powerless on the playground, he could become invincible behind a microphone. He spent his teenage years practicing his craft relentlessly, staying up all night rhyming words in the dark. He fell deeply in love with a local girl named Kim Douglas, a relationship that would become the most volatile, passionate, and destructive romance in music history. When their daughter, Haley Jade, was born on Christmas Day in 1995, Marshall and Oppo's artistic hustle turned into a desperate race against starvation. He was working 60 hours a week as a short-order cook and dishwasher at a local diner, making minimum wage while trying to launch his rap career. Then came the ultimate crushing defeat. In 1996, he poured his last remaining dollars and his entire soul into his debut independent album, Infinite. He hoped it would be his ticket out of poverty, but the local Detroit hip-hop community completely rejected it. Critics mocked him, telling him he should go into rock and roll because white people had no business making rap music. The rejection was so severe, and the financial pressure of providing for his newborn daughter was so suffocating, that Marshall completely snapped. He felt like an absolute failure as a man, a father, and an artist. He attempted suicide by taking an overdose of Tylenol, desperately wanting to quiet the screaming voices of failure in his head. He survived, but the gentle, hopeful Marshall Mathers died that night. In his place, a dark, vengeful alter ego was born from the ashes of his humiliation, a character who would stop at nothing to make the world suffer just as much as he had. By the late 1990s, Dr. Dre discovered the raw talent buried in Detroit, and the world was introduced to Slim Shady. The money came rushing in, but instead of bringing peace, it brought an unprecedented level of public scrutiny and intense legal warfare. By 2001, Eminem had become the most controversial figure in modern entertainment. He was no longer just a musician, he was a political scapegoat. United States senators held congressional hearings denouncing his lyrics, claiming his music was a direct threat to the moral fabric of American youth. Protesters lined up outside his concerts, and the Federal Communications Commission issued heavy fines just for playing his songs on the radio. He was trapped in a new kind of cage, chased by paparazzi and condemned by the government. The pressure inside his personal life was reaching a dangerous boiling point. The very people who should have been his sanctuary became his fiercest legal adversaries. His mother, Debbie, filed a massive $10 million defamation lawsuit against him for lines he rapped about her lifestyle. Simultaneously, his volatile marriage to Kim completely disintegrated into a public spectacle. After a violent altercation outside a Detroit nightclub where Eminem witnessed another man kissing his estranged wife, he was arrested on felony weapon charges. The threat of a 5-year prison sentence loomed over his head, a terrifying reality that meant he could lose total custody of his beloved daughter, Haley. To cope with the mounting paranoia and the exhausting schedule of being a global pop icon, he began relying heavily on prescription downers like Vicodin and Valium just to numb the stress. The lowest point arrived during the winter of 2001. Eminem found himself physically and mentally isolated inside a heavily guarded mansion in the suburbs of Detroit. The creative spark that had fueled his rapid rise felt like it was suffocating under the weight of his own fame. Every line he wrote was scrutinized by lawyers, and every move he made was tracked by the media. He was deeply afraid that he had already reached his artistic peak and that his next move would be a commercial failure. The industry was waiting for him to stumble, eager to prove that the white rapper from Detroit was just a temporary shock value trend. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down at the potential ruin of his career, his freedom, and his family, holding a pen that felt heavier with every passing day. The turning point came when Eminem decided to step away from the microphone and onto a film set, plunging himself into the production of the semi-autobiographical movie, 8 Mile. Throughout 2002, he subjected himself to a grueling, 18-hour-a-day schedule. He would wake up at the crack of dawn to shoot intense emotional scenes on the freezing streets of Detroit, and then, instead of resting, he would spend his nights locked inside a tiny, claustrophobic recording trailer parked on the set. He was physically exhausted, mentally drained, and surviving on a dangerous cocktail of prescription sleeping pills. It was inside this high-pressure pressure cooker that the ultimate transformation took place. He was no longer just a rapper trying to shock people, he was an artist digging deep into his own origin story, confronting the ghosts of his past under the harsh glare of Hollywood lights. The moment of total artistic epiphany occurred late one evening inside that dark recording trailer. Eminem began messing around with a simple, driving guitar riff, a loop that felt like a steady, urgent heartbeat. As the music played over and over in the background, something shifted inside his brain. He started scribbling lyrics furiously on cheap paper napkins and wrinkled scripts. He realized that the immense anger, the poverty, and the humiliation he suffered during his youth were not things he should try to bury or escape. They were a goldmine of raw, human emotion. He understood that if he could distill all that pain into a single, universal message, he could transcend the hip-hop genre entirely and create something that would resonate with every single person who had ever been pushed into a corner by life. That legendary session produced Lose Yourself, a track that would become the definitive anthem of his entire career. It marked his transition from a controversial media villain into a bulletproof commercial monster. When he stepped into the recording booth to lay down the vocals, his voice had lost its playful, high-pitched Slim Shady sneer. It was replaced by a deep, authoritative, and deadly serious Marshall Mathers rasp. He issued a historic, uncompromising declaration to the world, warning that opportunity only knocks once, and that you have to lose yourself in the music and the moment before it slips away. With that single song, he successfully harnessed the darkness of his environment and turned it into pure, commercial gold. The monster was fully formed, completely unstoppable, and ready to conquer the global entertainment landscape. Once the monster was unleashed, 2002 became the year of absolute Eminem dominance, a level of cultural saturation that the music industry had never seen from a single artist. In May of that year, he dropped The Eminem Show, followed closely by the theatrical release of 8 Mile in November. He was working at a furious, almost terrifying pace, commanding the #1 album in the world and the #1 movie at the box office simultaneously. His creative explosion was unparalleled. He was no longer just writing songs, he was constructing elaborate, multi-layered lyrical mazes. He would pace around the studio floor, muttering strings of rhyming syllables to himself, filling up hundreds of legal pads with a dense, complex vocabulary that left traditional music critics completely breathless. To truly appreciate the technical genius of this peak era, one must look past the shock value and analyze the intricate structural mechanics of his pen. In massive hit singles like Without Me and Lose Yourself, Eminem elevated the entire science of hip-hop songwriting. He masterfully utilized multisyllabic rhyming, a technique where he would rhyme entire phrases rather than just the final word of a line, fitting complex internal rhymes into tight, syncopated rhythms. He took the heavy, classical concept of political satire and flipped it into a dark, accessible form of mainstream black comedy. He would use his vocal delivery like a percussion instrument, shifting his cadence smoothly from a rapid-fire, machine gun flow into a heavy, dramatic march that forced the listener to hang on to every single word. He proved that a white dropout from Detroit could manipulate the English language with the same precision as a classical poet. But this unprecedented level of global fame came with a devastating physical and mental toll. By the end of 2002, the lines separating Marshall Mathers, Eminem, and Slim Shady had completely blurred. He was no longer a human being, he was a corporate product trapped inside a manic lifestyle. His severe insomnia, driven by an exhaustive touring schedule and constant media scrutiny, caused his prescription pill addiction to spiral out of control. He was consuming dangerous amounts of downers just to fall asleep and handfuls of stimulants just to step onto the stage. He became a prisoner of his own massive success, locked away inside a multi-million-dollar fortress in Michigan, surrounded by round-the-clock security. He lived in constant fear of assassination, checking the security cameras obsessively and trusting absolutely no one. The genius poet had successfully conquered the world, but the very monster he created to protect himself had now become his ultimate jailer. As 2002 drew to a close, the frantic storm that had created the monster began to settle, leaving behind a completely altered cultural landscape. Eminem did not die a physical death like the tragic figures before him, but the reckless, bleach-blonde Slim Shady persona that had dominated the airwaves began a slow, inevitable march toward the grave. In the years that followed, the manic energy of that historic run took its final toll. The heavy reliance on prescription downers, which had peaked during the exhausting double schedule of filming and recording, eventually led to a catastrophic near-fatal overdose in 2007. His heart briefly failed, and he stood on the very brink of flatlining. It was the ultimate, tragic receipt for the pact he had signed with fame back in 2002, a stark reminder that you cannot play with a demon without eventually paying the price. Yet, Marshall Mathers survived the wreckage of his own creation, and the words he left behind in 2002 became an immortal blueprint for generations to come. His final artistic testament from that golden era was not a cry of defeat, but a validation of the forgotten. In tracks like Sing for the Moment, he laid bare his ultimate purpose. He acknowledged that he was a flawed, angry icon, but he proudly accepted the role of a cultural lightning rod because he knew his music was the only lifeline for millions of isolated, broken kids who had no voice of their own. His legacy was not defined by the lawsuits, the political boycotts, or the vulgar headlines, but by his ability to turn the absolute dirt of his life into a pristine, universal shield for the misunderstood. Looking back from the vantage point of 2026, nearly a quarter of a century after that explosive year, the legacy of Marshall Mathers is set in stone. He became the first hip-hop artist to win an Academy Award for Best Original Song, shattered every commercial sales record in music history, and earned a permanent place among the greatest lyricists to ever live. The politicians who once tried to censor his voice have faded into historical footnotes, while his intricate internal rhymes and syncopated cadences are studied with the same academic respect given to classical literature. He was a product of a broken home who used the English language to dismantle his oppressors and build an empire from a pad of paper. The monster of 2002 has grown quiet, the hair is no longer blonde, but the raw, brilliant poetry born from that chaotic year will echo through human history forever.